Oh, business fluctuations, economic ups and downs. We'll be following the business cycle, which is the irregular changes in the level of total output measured by real GDP. So we got an X and Y axis there. The Y axis you see is economic activity. That means, supply and demand, aggregate supply and demand is going real strong. And then, over time, that's your X axis at the bottom. So first, we'll start at the phase of the business cycle known as expansion. You might even label that, like in your little boxes there, number 1. So we'll start with expansion. Now, expansion is when consumer spending and just general aggregate supply and demand is up. Again, there can be exceptions to this, but that's generally what's going on. Factories and sellers, they're making more, they're producing more, people are, as a result, they're having good jobs, they're paying jobs, and they're buying more, and they're not under too much debt, ideally not under so much debt that they can't spend on things. If they expand very, very rapidly, then that's a boom rather than expansion, because generally the expansion happens gradually over time, but a boom can be a sharp spike. Eventually this will hit a peak. And at that point, GDP will generally start to level off at that peak and then begin to decline and goes into a period of contraction. Now, contraction just means that GDP is starting to decline from the peak, drop from the peak, and aggregate supply and demand is also starting to contract, become less, reduced. However, if this goes on for at least 6 months, then it's called a recession, which we'll talk about in the next slide. But generally, this contraction is nothing to worry about. It's a short-term thing. It happens. If you've got a sound business, you'll weather through it. They won't be your best years. May not be your happiest years as a business owner or as a consumer. But it happens. You get through it. It's fine. Because normally it's less than 6 months. It's only if it goes over 6 months, now all of a sudden you might start having to dip into savings, taking extra debt on, and we get really worried about recessions in this country. It can create a downward spiral where unemployment rises, debt deficits grow, wages begin to stagnate. That means wages aren't increasing even though price levels are increasing, which means workers are going to buy less, which means companies aren't making as much profits, so then they're going to downsize and let people go, and that means less taxes are getting paid because less profits are being generated and people aren't making as much to pay income taxes, so that means government has to cut programs. Government has to cut programs and debt gets really high, not necessarily because they're spending too much, but because all of a sudden their income drops because of this vicious cycle. As a result, education is one of the first things to get cut. Workers are less educated, therefore they're less able to find jobs, and unemployment rises, which then causes deficits to grow. The vicious cycle continues and continues and continues. Then, ideally, it hits what's known as a trough. That's the lowest point, kind of like the opposite of a peak, where that decline levels off and stops dropping, and levels off for a while, and then starts to expand again. This is called a period of recovery, and it's pretty much the same thing as expansion, but it's that period right after a recession or a depression, as we'll go into, ends, and we start to improve again. And recovery period continues until we hopefully achieve the previous peak and then go into a new area of expansion where we go beyond our last peak. So that even though we have many ups and downs, these business fluctuations in the business cycle, over time, as long as we keep generally going up and up and up and to the right, that's the goal. Again, we can't avoid contractions. That's just part of reality. Deal with it. We hope to avoid recessions, and we definitely want to avoid depressions because that makes recovery periods extended and becomes much more difficult, and for some countries almost impossible to ever get out of recovery, maybe even enter recovery, and forget about even trying to get into expansion and trying to hit a new peak.